Hey there, welcome to Big Al Books. Today I'll be telling you about the books that I read in December, which was a weirdly productive reading month for me, but I'm not going to question it. So lately I've been in the middle of a reading experiment that I wanted to tell you about. So in the month of December, I decided to only read authors who I have previously read before, and now in the month of January, I'm trying to only read authors who are brand new to me. I was kind of curious to see which of these months would be a more enjoyable reading experience for me, so I was wondering whether I find more satisfaction from diving deeper into an author's back catalog. For the most part, I chose authors who I already really know and enjoy, so I was wondering if it would be a better month for me to choose things that I was pretty sure that I was going to like, or if I find it more satisfying to find new and exciting things and to discover new voices. So I guess we'll talk at the end of January which month I ended up enjoying more. But I can tell you now that December is going to be an extremely difficult month to beat because I had one of my strongest reading months ever in December. Definitely my favorite reading month from 2019. So I discovered a lot of great books and I'm very excited to tell you about them today. So I'm going to break up this video into a few different categories. So first we're going to talk about the authors that I viewed as my kind of second chance authors. So these are ones who I've read before, but I haven't really loved anything by them ever, and I wanted to give them a second chance to impress me. For my second category, I want to tell you about some authors who I return to, who I already have favorable impressions of, and I wanted to see if I could find some new favorites by them. And then for my third category, I'm going to talk about some books that I read by some of my all-time favorite authors. So before we get started with those, there is one exception. So one book that I read that doesn't really fit in this theme of the month is the Saga of the Icelanders. The Icelandic Sagas aren't really famous for having been written by one author, so I didn't read this because of my author challenge, but rather because I just wanted to finish this book by the end of the calendar year. I read probably about 2/3 of it back in January, and I enjoyed it a lot, but I ended up putting it down for a few months, I guess, and then I started picking it back up again in December, and I really just wanted to finish it up by the end of the year. So this is kind of my one exception. This book is quite comprehensive. It is about 700 pages of good old sagas, and I did quite enjoy this for the most part. Even though some of the sagas in this collection are quite long, at around 100 to 200 pages, what they tend to do is to focus mostly on the action of the story, so it's not really full of a bunch of boring descriptive passages or like interior moments of what the characters are thinking. Really, it's just going from one violent event to the next because most people who moved to Iceland were exiles from Norway, so they were kind of outlawed to begin with. So a lot of the Icelanders are kind of rule breakers, even though they have this very interesting style of government where they come together as a community to make decisions. There are still a lot of people who are just getting into trouble in these sagas, which makes them pretty fun to follow along. So there is quite a lot of action, a lot of adventure. Everyone's hopping in a boat and traveling all around Scandinavia. So I did really enjoy reading this collection for the most part, and I liked learning a bit more about Icelandic culture and history. I also wanted to quickly mention the two rereads that I got around to this month. One of them is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. I really love this book, and I think I've reread it at least 2 other times now. And it's one of those books that just gets stronger and stronger each time that you read it because there is an unreliable narrator that is giving you the story. So it really just starts to make more sense, and you appreciate how well crafted this book is after you've experienced the story a few times. And I picked this one up because I added it as a reading option to one of my English courses. So I initially just wanted to check out a few little details from this so I could discuss it with my students, and then I just couldn't put it back down, and I ended up rereading it over the course of one weekend because it just pulled me back into its world and I just loved experiencing it again. Then my other reread of the month is a play. It's called Acadia by Tom Stoppard. I don't really know if this counts as a reread because I've seen the play live before. So I've experienced the story, I've watched it being performed, but I've never sat down and read the text by myself at home. So I guess I don't really know if this counts as a reread, but this is a play that I enjoyed a heck of a lot. This is a play that's set at an English manor in the countryside. However, we see it from 2 different points in history. So some of the scenes are set back in 1809, where we meet the family that's living in this household, and we're getting caught up with the different dramatic affairs that are happening at the house at the time. And then there are also some scenes that are set in more of a present era where there are a few scholars that are visiting the house, and they each have different theories about the house and famous people who were there, and they're trying to work on their academic research while creating some more drama of their own. So it's a really fun structure to the play, how you're kind of like jumping back and forth, and the information that you learn in one scene might contradict with what the characters are thinking in another scene. Tom Stoppard is very funny, very witty, very charming, but he also addresses a lot of big philosophical ideas in here. Particularly, there's a lot of ideas about like mathematics and physics and poetry and love. So a lot of big topics going on in here, but it's never pretentious, and you really do get invested in these characters and their relationships with one another. So I had a lot of fun revisiting this play and getting to read some of the scenes in more detail. However, reading it again though did make me wish that I could see it live again. So I will be looking out for another production of this because it's a really great play. Alright, so next I'm going to tell you about the books that I read by my second chance authors who I didn't have the best first impression of, but I really wanted to give them another go around. So I have 5 of these books to talk about, and I'm going to go in the order of least enjoyed to most enjoyed. So, unfortunately, starting with my least enjoyable read of the month, that was The Unnamable by Samuel Beckett. This is the 3rd book in his trilogy, which is kind of one of those works of experimental literature that's hailed as very groundbreaking and very influential, but from my experience, not at all enjoyable to read. So back in the summer, I read Malloy and Malone Dies, and I will say that I got a little bit of enjoyment out of Malloy. It was weird, but it was kind of funny in a tragic sort of way. Malone Dies was a bit rougher on me, and then in the summer I also tried to read The Unnamable, but I just couldn't. Like, I had to DNF it because this book is kind of taking place from the perspective of someone who has just recently died, and they're in this really bleak, dark version of the afterlife where pretty much nothing is happening, and it's kind of like this head that's suspended in the darkness who is just unable to stop talking. So you can see that pretty much the whole story is just told through one long, unbroken paragraph as this dying consciousness releases their final thoughts into the universe. And it's a pretty bleak read, so you can see why I couldn't handle this in August during the summer months. Like, that's when I'm at my happiest. So I thought, December, it's pretty bleak, it's pretty dark. I kind of have this little joke where I like to read depressing stuff in December to kind of counteract all of the holiday cheer that I'm surrounded by. But even so, even in December, it was a bit too much for me. There's basically no plot to speak of. That's kind of why these books are heralded as so innovative, because Beckett sort of strips away the things that you would expect to find in a novel, like character development or plot. Unfortunately, I realized that I kind of like those things, so reading a novel without any of those was kind of dry, to say the least. I would force myself to read this every night while I was brushing my teeth, so I didn't feel like I was wasting too much of my time. But yeah, I really had to force my way through this one, otherwise I would not have been able to have finished the trilogy. And I'm kind of sad about this because I really love the play Waiting for Godot, and I really wanted to like Samuel Beckett. I thought that we could be buds. I did a project on him in my grade 12 French class, so I really wanted him to be a favorite author, but I had a kind of difficult time reading his novels, so I think I'll go back to his plays. I'm going to continue to try him, but just the trilogy didn't really work for me. The next second chance author that I tried was Jennifer Egan. I read her book, A Visit to the Goon Squad, which was kind of one of those books that was getting a lot of buzz a few years ago. But to be honest, I don't remember a single thing about that book, except that there was a chapter that was told through PowerPoint, which is not the best thing to remember about it. I think I thought it was fine at the time. So I wanted to give her another go. The Keep, I also thought would be like a moody, mysterious book since it's set at this kind of gothic castle setting in Europe. It's the tale of these 2 cousins, and one of them basically is responsible for causing a traumatic incident to the other cousin. So then when they reunite as adults, you think that it's kind of going to be like this messed up revenge story. Unfortunately, it's not really as exciting as the premise sets out to be, so I didn't really think that it was as creepy or as dramatic or exciting as I was hoping it was going to be. And this was also told through 2 narratives. So you had the story of the cousins in the castle, and then you also had this prison inmate who is taking a writing class and is the one who is creating the story for his class. And I really thought that the prison sections were a lot weaker, so it really took you out of the story when you had to go through the prison chapters. And I also don't really like when authors are trying to like write down in their voice. So Jennifer Egan was trying to convincingly write in the voice of this badass convict, and I just didn't really feel like it was convincing. It kept the writing to be like very simplistic so that the descriptions weren't very impressive, but also the voice just wasn't authentic. Like, there was a sentence in here where she explained what a shank was, which I feel like no prisoner would do. Like, you just have to know that going into it. So this was kind of okay, but just not at all what I was hoping that it was going to be. So I guess I'm still kind of lukewarm about Jennifer Egan. And then the next one that I'm going to talk about is The Rehearsal by Eleanor Catton. She's much more well known for writing The Luminaries, her giant book, which I read back in March. And The Luminaries was ultimately a disappointing read for me. I was very excited about it. It has this wonderful, mysterious atmosphere, but I guess I just didn't really feel what that novel was building up to. I just kind of felt a little underwhelmed by the end of it, which is not what you want to feel after investing 800 pages of your time into something. But even though The Luminaries didn't quite connect with me, I could still appreciate that Eleanor Catton is insanely ambitious and skilled, so I wanted to try her out again, and The Rehearsal sounded like it was much more up my alley in terms of its subject matter, since this is about teenagers and young adults who are involved in music and drama, which was very my life when I was a teenager. And it's about a sex scandal that happens at an all-girls high school where the band teacher starts having an affair with one of his students. But what's cool about this book is that it's really not about the teacher or the student, but it's more about the effect that this relationship has on the rest of the girls in the school. So it's kind of about like this like secondhand kind of ripple effect. So they all sort of experience this weird loss of innocence by going through this scandal, and it's starting to change their thoughts and their perspectives about sex and power and their relationships with adults. So that was a fascinating angle to take with this story, and I think that that was really smart. The other sections of this book have to do with a prestigious theater college, and in that sense, it reminded me a lot of Trust Exercise by Susan Choi, which also deals with how drama programs can kind of warp the actors. In training to become a good actor, you kind of have to really experiment and delve deep into your own self. So those sections were pretty interesting too. Ultimately, I did end up enjoying this book, but not quite as much as I was hoping to, which was kind of the situation with The Luminaries, in that I enjoy the experience that you're having on the page while you're reading, but I just feel like at the end of it, it doesn't build up into something very impressive or memorable. So maybe that's something that I'm missing with Eleanor Catton's writing. You can tell that she's very smart, and she's very clever the way that she writes characters and the way that they talk to each other. But at the same time, there's something that just keeps me from really connecting to her work or seeing the larger value of it. So I enjoyed it, but again, she just doesn't seem to be an author that I truly love. Then next up on my list is the only nonfiction book that I read this month, but at least it was a good one. So this is a biography of Cleopatra, and it's written by Stacy Schiff. I had previously read her book called The Witches about the Salem witch trials before, which was an okay read, but it was somehow kind of dull and dry, even though you'd think that it would be this very exciting and charged subject. So I did end up liking Cleopatra a lot more. This was definitely more of an engrossing kind of biography. And I really appreciate what she's trying to do with this project, where she's trying to kind of clear the slate a little bit with Cleopatra, because Cleopatra is just such a famous historical figure. Everyone has all these different ideas of what they think Cleopatra is and who she was. And Schiff is kind of setting the record straight here that a lot of what we know about her is inaccurate. So there are a lot of sketchy details in her story that Schiff tries to correct. Unfortunately for Schiff, there's also a lot of missing history as well. So there's really only so much that she can do. But she's one of those biographers that really tries to immerse you into the setting where she's writing. So there are a lot of these really lush descriptions of Alexandria at the time. She does a good job of covering a lot of the Roman military history that you need to know to stay caught up in the story while not letting that aspect take over. And I thought she did a good job of trying to interpret what Cleopatra's personality might have been like beyond some kind of temptress. So she raised a lot of good points about the things that were very unique about Cleopatra and some of the strengths that she probably had as a ruler that she doesn't seem to get credit for. And then last up, we have The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, which was by far my biggest, most pleasant surprise of the month. I loved this thing. And I had previously only ever read Never Let Me Go by this author, which I know is a book that a lot of people love, but I really didn't like it. I thought that it was aggressively dull. So he was an author that I was not coming in with favorable impressions of, but I know that a lot of people love this one too, and I am very interested in the subject of butlers, the people who are working in these large English countryside manors. Since I was interested in the subject matter, I gave this one a go, and I was so impressed. This was a book that I was just trying to squeeze in. It was after Christmas, but before New Year's, and I just wanted to try to finish something before the year was over, and I was not expecting to just fall in love with this book and to read it as quickly as I did, because I just got so drawn into the story that I really couldn't put it down. I found the narrative voice of this novel to be so engaging. You have this aging butler who's looking back on his life and he's trying to figure out what it all added up to, because he sacrificed a lot of things to become a truly great butler, and he's wondering if it was all worth it in the end, whether he ended up having a meaningful life. But I feel like the narrator does a great job of withholding a lot of key information in the earlier sections of the book, and you can really see how his mind is kind of trying to protect himself from some hard truths, and it's just so flawless how his thoughts slowly change and how more and more of his insecurities and his fears are revealed as this novel continues. So this is one of the few books where I can say that I feel like it was just flawlessly constructed, which is not something that I say very often, but I just feel like this book was just perfect. It really felt like every word was in place, and it was so masterfully controlled how he shaped the narrative and artfully drew the reader into the story. Nothing in this book seems overdone or excessive. It's so controlled, it's so subtle, and it's a truly gorgeous novel, and it's a very emotional read. And I also did just watch the film version of this with Anthony Hopkins this past weekend, which was also another really enjoyable take on this story. However, I think that you can't beat this book. It is just too good. So for my next category, I have 7 books to talk about, and these are all by authors who I liked going into the month and who I all appreciate even more by the end of the month. So I guess I'll rank these again from least favorite to favorite, even though I enjoyed all of these a lot. So it was kind of hard to put them in any kind of order. But to start off, let's go with Pastoralia by George Saunders. I've previously read 2 short story collections by George Saunders, and I have to say, I really like how this guy writes short stories, because his stories are always weird, and usually the main characters in his stories are kind of pathetic, tragic characters, but I feel like he's some kind of empathy master, because by the end of each story, he always has you feeling for these weird misfit characters. And the stories in this collection were pretty good. Unfortunately, this collection suffered a little bit from not being quite as remarkable as the other 2 that I've read. Even though the stories in this collection are pretty solid, I just didn't quite love them as much as some of his other ones, though there were a few standouts in here. There was one particular story in this collection that I loved called Sea Oak, and it was about this woman who had really sacrificed everything for her family. She just worked so hard her entire life. She never took time or money for herself, and then she ended up dying at a pretty young age, and she comes back from the grave and basically haunts her family, and she's kind of cursing them because she is so mad that she wasted her time on Earth and never took more time for herself. So she's kind of messing up the lives of her family members and causing a lot of chaos. So I thought that one was a lot of fun. The next book that I have to talk about is His Excellency Eugène Rougon. This is by Emile Zola, and this was translated from the French by Brian Nelson. This is the second book that I've read in the Rougon series, which is a cycle of 20 novels that follows two branches of a French family. I read my first Rougon novel last year, and I totally loved it, and I meant to get back to the series a lot sooner, because if I continue to read them at the pace that I'm at, I won't finish the series until I'm like 50, which seems like too long, so I do need to keep upping the pace. But I was kind of putting off reading this one because I thought it would be really boring, because this follows the career of a family member who works in politics. So Eugène works as an official for Emperor Napoleon III, and at the start of the novel, his career is kind of at this low point where he's been forced to resign from his position, and it's kind of about how him and his friends are scheming for him to gain his power back again. So it's all about political intrigue and the rise and the fall of this kind of career, and how you're surrounded by these false friends who are really only trying to get favors out of you. And I'm not traditionally that interested in politics. That's kind of why I was avoiding this book. But I will say that Zola made it very interesting, very engaging, that I found this book a lot more fun than I expected it to be, and I look forward to continuing on in this series in 2020. The next book up is There But For The by Ali Smith. This is maybe my fifth Ali Smith novel, and I have to say that, I'm really starting to get what an Ali Smith novel is. Now that I've read more Ali Smith, I feel like I know what to expect from her novels, which allows me to enjoy them more. Because if you go in expecting a traditional narrative, you're going to be kind of confused. But if you go in expecting to just have a good time in Ali Smith's weird and wonderful world that is just filled with puns and witty, crackling prose, then you're gonna have a grand old time. So this was one of her most enjoyable books for me so far. And basically, it's about a man who gets invited to this dinner party, and he excuses himself to go upstairs and basically enters this bedroom and then refuses to leave. And this book is looking at this issue from various people's perspective. So we kind of learn about a few characters who have been connected to this man in one way or another throughout their life. My favorite scene of this novel, for sure, was the dinner party where this man decided to go off into hiding in this bedroom. It featured such hilarious dialogue. It was very spot on that there were just these grown-ups trying to sound smart, trying to say these witty things, but then most of them ended up coming across as making quite boorish or unfortunate or ignorant remarks. So that scene was just totally hilarious. So overall, I found this to be a very pleasurable reading experience once you learn to take delight in Ali Smith's writing. It's just a lot of fun reading her books. She made me laugh a lot with this book, and I really appreciate the way that she was exploring the connections that people are able to form in their lifetime, how we're able to make these bonds and learn more about the world through other people. And sometimes you don't realize that you're forming an important connection until later on in your life, or maybe you'll never realize that it was an important connection. So I quite enjoyed this book, and I am really enjoying the process of getting to know Ali Smith as an author and working my way through her back catalog. Next up, we have Mildred Pierce by James M. Cain. He's definitely one of my favorite author discoveries of 2019. Earlier this year, I read his grim noir novellas, The Postman Always Rings Twice and Double Indemnity. But Mildred Pierce is kind of the odd one out in this collected work because this is just a full-length novel. So while I didn't quite love it as much as I did his noir novellas, I still thought that this was a pretty cool novel, especially for the time period that it was written in. I think it comes from the 1940s. And this is following the struggles of a single mom. So at first, she's really embarrassed to have to take up a job as a waitress. It's really shameful for her to have to work in customer service. However, then she starts this side hustle where she starts baking pies to sell at the restaurant where she works. And this kind of is the beginning of her journey as an entrepreneur. And she just keeps improving and expanding on her business model until she's the successful owner of a few different restaurants. So this book was pretty gripping, watching this woman try to climb the career ladder. However, this being James M. Cain, you know that it's not some kind of happy-go-lucky American dream success story. No, his stories are much too dark and twisted for that. So you are going to see this woman make some poor decisions that are going to lead to the disintegration of many key relationships in her life. So that's kind of like half the fun with this book is watching her struggle to succeed and then watching it all get real messed up in the final act of this book. So I really liked seeing this different side of James M. Cain as a writer. So while I still think that I prefer his novellas, Postman and Double Indemnity are just perfect in my opinion, I still thought that this was a cool novel, so I'm glad that it was included in this collection, otherwise I might have missed out on it. And if you're looking for one book that is a great starter for James M. Cain, cannot recommend this Everyman's Library edition highly enough. Also, it includes, as a bonus, some selected stories at the end, and those were all pretty weird and twisted too. So this was one of my favorite reads of this year. It was a lot of fun. Next up, I read The Castle by Franz Kafka. This was translated by Mark Harman. And like I mentioned before, I like reading gloomy and depressing books in December, so I thought this moody, atmospheric read would fit the bill. And this is basically about a man who is moving to this strange small village. And he's going there because he's supposed to start a job as a land surveyor. He's supposed to go to work at this castle, but then he finds out that he is not allowed to enter the castle. But also, he's not really getting a lot of clear instructions as to how he's supposed to proceed with his job. So he's given enough little information to know that he is there and he's supposed to be working, but he's never given enough information to know what it is that he's supposed to be doing, who he's supposed to be talking to, what he's supposed to do to go forward. He is like living his life in this perpetual fog of confusion and bureaucracy and just never getting the answers that he needs. So it's kind of a frustrating read in that sense, because you, the reader, are going through the exact same situation that he is, where you're just kind of like, what is happening? Like, first of all, there's so many strange dynamics that are happening in this small village. Like, everyone in here is so weird. It's kind of like they're in some kind of cult. And at first you're really intrigued to just find out, like, what is going on? Why are these characters so odd? And then almost by the second half of this, you've grown to accept that, like, nothing has happened and nothing is going to happen. And I guess that that's kind of Kafka's whole stance on bureaucracy and kind of like the meaninglessness of that procedure and man's life as a worker in the modern world as not really something that's very productive or valuable, or something that's just kind of like deeply mystifying perhaps. So while this is a book that I could see could be like really frustrating and boring, I somehow found it to be very entrancing for some reason. So even though very little happens in this, I was just very drawn into the confusion, and I was very along for the ride for this one. So it's just very cryptic, very strange, but if you like Kafka, I mean, this is just what he does so well. So I really enjoyed checking out another book by him. I think The Trial is still my favorite, but this was a perfect, confusing, weird winter read. Next up, I read Days by Moonlight by André Alexis. André Alexis's previous novel, 15 Dogs, is one of my favorite Canadian novels. It is just so brilliant, so moving. So I was kind of scared to try him again just because I love that book so much, and I thought, like, there's no way this can measure up. But I was pleasantly surprised that this is also a fantastic book in its own rights. You know, it doesn't hit on the same notes as 15 Dogs. It's not kind of tragic in that sense, but this is still just a charming story. And I think part of the reason why I loved it so much is that it's about a road trip that's taking place in small towns in southern Ontario. And there's something that's just so exciting and enjoyable when you're reading about the part of the world where you come from. So I got to read about towns where I've either been to or places that I've heard about before, but you get to see them in this entirely new light because André Alexis is making this book very mystical in some ways. So some of these towns have these like very strange happenings. Some of his depictions of the towns were more gently satiric, where he's kind of making fun of the attitudes and customs that people in Ontario have. The novel is all tied together through this story of a professor who's traveling to these small towns in order to learn more about an underappreciated Canadian poet. So he wants to find out about the towns where he lived and meet some of the people that he knew so that he can learn more about this mysterious literary figure. The narrator of the story is a guy who's been brought along to drive the professor around, and he's the person himself who's experienced a lot of grief. He's reflecting on losing both of his parents and recently going through a breakup, so this is going to be kind of a game-changing road trip for him. He's going to have a certain transformative experience, and really, even though the characters were really well fleshed out, it was mostly just the setting and the writing that just really captivated me with this book, so I absolutely loved this. And if you are from Ontario yourself, I think you should check this one out because it was just a wonderful, really enjoyable reflection on this province. Then last up on this list is The Ice Shirt by William T. Vollmann. You might have heard me talk about this book in my favorite books of 2019 video because this was one of the best reads that I got to this year, which I was pumped about because I've been excited to read this book for a long time. So I talked about this book more at length in that video, so you can go hear more of my thoughts there. But essentially, this is the first book in a series called the Seven Dreams series, and it's basically 7 different visions of colonialism, where European settlers have come over to North America and encountered indigenous people and have had some kind of catastrophic clash of cultures in one way or another. So this first book has to do with Vikings. So we have the Greenlanders who crossed over to the east coast of North America and clashed with what they called the Skraeling people. And this book is not your dry history. This incorporates so many elements from Norse mythology and the sagas and from Inuit culture and legends. Like, it is just a fantastical interpretation of events with some really wild events that happened and some fascinating characters. And for my last section, I want to tell you quickly about a few books that I read from some authors who I consider to be some of my all-time favorites. So let's start off with one. If you watch my channel, you know that I talk about Shakespeare a lot. I am that nerdy English teacher who really gets a thrill out of reading Shakespeare in the classroom and also on my own time. So of course, during my winter vacation, I wanted to work my way through a few of his plays. So the ones that I read in December were The Winter's Tale and Antony and Cleopatra. So let's start off with The Winter's Tale. This is one of his late period comedies, which means that he was getting kind of weird with the genre. And I guess the weird thing with this story is that it's pretty sad and gloomy for like the first few acts of it, because it's about a husband who's like extremely jealous of his wife, and it causes him to make these really terrible decisions. So I guess that's kind of like the Winter's Tale part of this. It is like this just gloomy story about this family just completely falling apart. But then you do get a bit of the springtime in the story. It is kind of a story of like renewal and rebirth, and the story jumps forward 18 years into the future, and you find out what these characters have been up to and how they're all going to try to like work their way back to each other. So probably not one of my favorite of Shakespeare's comedies, but it was entertaining and engaging all the way through. Also, this play is pretty well known for containing the iconic stage direction "Exit Pursued by a Bear." So I definitely enjoyed getting to see that scene play out in the play. And then also the ending for this is like very cryptic, and I don't really know how to interpret it. I think if you were seeing it live, it could either be this really powerful, transformative moment, or it would just be really weird and a huge fail. So I'd be very curious to see this live, because it seems to be a play of kind of contradictions. A lot going on in this one, though, so glad I checked it out. And then the next one that I read was Antony and Cleopatra. Of course, I wanted to pick this one up after reading Stacy Schiff's Cleopatra biography. And I think that this play was a little bit of a disappointment after having read that biography, because that was much more of like a fleshed out, nuanced portrayal of Cleopatra, whereas this, I feel like, very much so meets the like stereotypical portrait of Cleopatra that you'd expect. You know, this lavish ruler who's very seductive. It's all about her relationship with Mark Antony, how they meet, and how they come to their tragic end. Apparently, a lot of the poetry in this book is taken pretty much directly from Plutarch's account of the story. And I think maybe that was missing from this play was Shakespeare's originality. Like, you did kind of just feel like he was just following the story, and it just didn't seem all that fresh or exciting. So it's kind of weird for me not to love a Shakespearean tragedy, but I think he's more in his element when he's kind of just like making up his story and just taking it in all the wild directions that he wants to, whereas this just felt like he was kind of playing it safe and just giving you the version of the history that he knew. So it's perfectly fine, but just didn't really capture me emotionally. Next up, I have two works by some of my favorite Russian authors. One of them is The Heart of a Dog by Mikhail Bulgakov. This was translated by Michael Glennie, and this is a book that I've owned for quite a while, but I've kind of put off reading because Bulgakov wrote my favorite book of all time, The Master and Margarita, and I've just kind of been worried about trying his other stuff because I just feel like I can't love it as much as I loved The Master and Margarita. And I mean, while that's true, you know, this isn't my new favorite book or anything like that, it still was really enjoyable, and I think this book helped me appreciate what I like so much about Bulgakov. So even though the story is much less epic in scope than The Master and Margarita, it's still just like really weird and really funny. So for some reason, I think that I share some kind of sick sense of humor with Bulgakov because like he just had me in stitches quite a lot with this book. So it's kind of like this Frankenstein experiment that's happening in Moscow during the Soviet years, where these doctors have basically performed this brain operation on a dog, and somehow they've managed to insert human glands and hormones into this dog. So he survives this operation, and every week he keeps becoming more and more human-like. So he's kind of this disturbing creature, and basically the longer that he's human, the more depraved he becomes. And these doctors realize that they have just made a huge mistake in tampering with science. But there are some seriously funny moments in here, and this dog is truly a terrifying, super weird character. So I'm glad that I finally faced my fears and got around to reading this slim and strange novella. And then the second work of Russian literature that I read was Memoirs from the House of the Dead by Dostoevsky, and this was translated into English by Jesse Colson. So again, like I mentioned before, I like reading depressing books in December. Last December, I read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn, which is another prison memoir from the Siberian persuasion. So I thought it would be fun to read this one as well in December. Now, funnily enough, as depressing as a prison memoir can be, this one somehow didn't seem as bad as One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, because that takes place during the Soviet years, and it is just like so bleak. The prisoners are so hungry and so overworked. It's such a struggle to survive. Things were a little bit better pre-Soviet times in Siberia. I'm not saying that they were great. I'm not saying that, you know, Dostoevsky had a good time in prison, but, you know, it seemed like there was a lot of bread, and it was good quality bread, and the aristocratic people were still allowed to keep some of their money so they could pay to have servants. So there was a certain amount of comfort, I guess, in comparison. So I wasn't expecting to see that out of a Siberian prison story. This book is pretty famous for being like the first work where Dostoevsky really emerged as like a serious Russian novelist. So it was really cool reading this book to watch his development as a writer, seeing how he's grown. You can see that he's someone that is just so interested in character. So he befriends the different people in the prison, and he's trying to get their story, and he's trying to get more insight into their character. So it's very psychological. You know, he's trying to understand what prison does to the human condition and kind of how it changes your mindset and all of that. Overall, this was a pretty fascinating read, and I did enjoy seeing how Dostoevsky really grew as a thinker and a writer in this text. And lastly, to wrap things up, let's talk about all the Neil Gaiman that I read this month, because there was a lot. So I don't know if you were following my channel 2 years ago. I talked about this very formative experience where I listened to Neil Gaiman's collection of essays called A View from the Cheap Seats on audio. And there was just kind of this 2-month period of my life where whenever I was driving in my car, Neil Gaiman was right there with me, telling me about his life and all of the books that he likes to read and all of his wonderful thoughts. So that's kind of like the time period that really bonded me to Neil. Like, of course, I don't know him, but I feel like having spent that time with him and his voice, I feel like we have a connection, you know? So, like, he's just someone that I have this inexplicable fondness for. So, can't really explain it. But this month was really epic for me in finishing the complete Sandman series. So in November, I read volumes 1 through 3, and then in December, I finished up the series with volumes 4 through 10, and then I also read this extra 11th volume that was written a few years after the series was completed, and it's like a short stories collection from the perspective of each of the main characters from the Endless family. So this one was really cool and a nice way to end things off. I talked about this series and why I loved it so much in more detail in my favorite books of the year video, but basically, in short, I can totally understand why this is such a revered classic in the world of comics and graphic novels. I feel like this series just succeeds on all fronts because it has truly amazing artwork, and Gaiman collaborates with so many wonderful artists to put this series together, so it's just truly impressive on a visual standpoint, and the story itself is well constructed. You know, it veers off in a lot of different directions. There's a huge cast of characters, and yet it continues to just build and build in intensity. By the time I got to volume 9, The Kindly Ones, which is where the story kind of climaxes, like, I couldn't put it down. I stayed up till like 4:30 in the morning to finish it because I just had to know what was going to happen. So this story features these remarkable, memorable characters and this intriguing and intense plot with this imaginative, expansive view of the universe. So it really has everything that I look for in a comic book series. So this was just such a wonderful read. I really do highly recommend it if you're looking for something that is different, dark, and immersive in the world of comics. And then finally, the last thing that I read by Neil Gaiman was this short little fairy tale retelling, and that is Snow Glass Apples. So this is a retelling of Snow White, which is my favorite fairy tale because when I was a toddler, I would watch the Disney version of Snow White pretty much every day, and I was very invested in the character of the evil hag. She's kind of like was my role model growing up. Make of that what you will. I feel like it explains a lot about my weird personality. But anyway, this is great if you like your fairy tale retellings dark and twisted. You know, this is definitely for adults. Don't give this to your kid who loves Snow White because it will mess them up for life, probably. So this is just really flipping the story on its head. It is told from the Queen's perspective, but I love that this book doesn't do us dirty like the Maleficent style of storytelling, where they try to take the story from the villain's perspective and make them sympathetic because we just didn't understand what was happening. Like, in this story, the Queen appears a little bit less evil than she did in the books, but it's not because she's particularly a good person, but it's because Snow White is like this blood-sucking vampire demon child. So that was an interesting twist. So I really like that they took this children's tale and just made it super messed up and weird. The other thing that I have to mention for this graphic novel is that it is truly gorgeous. Colleen Doran does the illustrations, and if you can see from the cover here, like, she has this really intricate style of design. So anytime that it like features costumes or fabrics, like, there's just so much detail in the artwork that I really didn't know how to read this because I wanted to like speed through it to find out what was going to happen with the story. But I also wanted to spend like an hour looking at each page because it was so beautiful. So I was really glad that I checked this one out. I just kind of picked it up on a whim at my bookstore one day, not knowing anything about it. But yeah, this did not disappoint me. It served up some twisted fairy tale realness, and I was here for it the whole time. So that's it for all the books that I read in December. As you can see, it was an awesome reading month, and I found it so much fun to end my reading year by just celebrating so many of my favorite authors and just returning to these writers and discovering some new works by them. So it was really great. We shall see if January will end up being an even stronger reading month. I don't know. I'll let you know in my January wrap-up. But that's it for me today. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I'll see you again next time.